George Clooney was a man who had it all. At least, that's what everyone believed. He had built a successful business, owned a beautiful home in California, and was married to Marie, a woman who seemed perfect in every way. To the outside world, their life was enviable, filled with love, success, and prosperity. But behind the closed doors of their immaculate home, the warmth and affection that once defined their marriage had begun to cool. The passionate love they once shared had turned into something more routine, more functional. George noticed Marie becoming increasingly distant, often lost in her own world. Their conversations, once full of laughter and shared dreams, had dwindled into the mundane, brief exchanges about the day, the groceries, or the next dinner party. George tried to rekindle their relationship, planning romantic dinners and weekend getaways, even suggesting they start the family they had always talked about. But Marie seemed disinterested, always finding excuses to avoid spending time together. She had become an enigma, her once familiar habits replaced by a shroud of secrecy. One evening, after another tense dinner where Marie barely spoke, George sat alone in his study, nursing a glass of whiskey. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Over the weeks, he had noticed the subtle changes, a secretive text message here, a hushed phone call there. Marie had become adept at hiding things from him, but George was observant. The small details added up, each one a piece of a puzzle he didn't want to complete. As George sat in their bedroom, his mind raced with suspicions. Could she be having an affair? The thought gnawed at him, but he pushed it away, not wanting to believe it. He had always trusted Marie, believed in their love, but now that trust was crumbling under the weight of his doubts. Unable to ignore the signs any longer, George decided to confront Marie. But before he could gather the courage, fate intervened in the most chilling way. It was a cold, rainy night when George's worst fears were confirmed. He had come home late from the office, exhausted and soaked to the bone. As he entered the house, he heard Marie's voice, low and urgent, coming from the living room. Instinctively, he moved silently towards the sound, staying hidden in the shadows. Marie was on the phone, her back to him, speaking in a hushed tone that sent a chill down George's spine. "Tonight," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When he's asleep, I'll leave the door unlocked, and you can set the fire. I just want it to look like an accident. No one can know. By the time anyone notices, he'll be gone, and I'll be free and rich." George felt the blood drain from his face. He stood frozen in place, his heart pounding in his ears. The woman he had loved, the woman he had vowed to spend his life with, was plotting his murder. And not just any murder, a cold, calculated plan to set the house on fire with him inside. He strained to hear the voice on the other end of the line, but it was muffled, indistinct. However, the intent was clear. Marie had a partner in this plot, someone who would carry out the dirty work while she played the grieving widow. "Are you sure about this?" the voice asked, filled with anxiety. Marie's voice took on a sinister tone. "Trust me, it's foolproof. He's always such a heavy sleeper. It's now or never." George felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath him. He left the home secretly to come back later. George spent the rest of the evening in a daze, his mind whirring with the grim knowledge of Marie's plan. He knew he had to act fast, but he also knew that any misstep could cost him his life. He couldn't confront her, not yet. If Marie suspected that he knew, she might change her plans, or worse, strike even sooner. So, George played along. He didn't go back home and decided to spend the night in a motel room. He called Marie and said there's a late-night project he wants to complete at office, pretending everything was normal. Meanwhile, Marie postponed the plan to tomorrow. As the hours ticked by, George formulated his own plan, a plan to turn the tables on Marie and her lover. He knew the house inside and out, every creak of the floorboards, every window and door. He would use that knowledge to his advantage. George spent the next day making careful preparations. He ensured that the fire alarms were disabled, knowing Marie would likely do the same, but he took it a step further. He added an extra lock to all THR doors in the house, one that could only be engaged from the inside, and placed an unnoticeable wedge under the windows to prevent them from opening. He also prepared an escape route, a way out that Marie and her accomplice wouldn't expect. Throughout the day, He observed Marie closely, watching for any sign that she suspected his awareness. But she was as cool and collected as ever, going about her day as if nothing were amiss. George marveled at her ability to deceive, but it only strengthened his resolve. As night fell, George followed his usual routine. He had dinner with Marie, made small talk, and even complimented her on how beautiful she looked. Marie smiled, but there was something in her eyes, a coldness that hadn't been there before. It was as if she had already written him off, as if in her mind, he was already dead. Later, as they got ready for bed, George could feel the tension in the air. Marie was more affectionate than she had been in weeks, brushing her hand against his arm, lingering as she kissed him goodnight. But George knew it was all part of her act, an effort to lower his guard. "Good night, love," she whispered, her voice sweet and soothing. "Good night," George replied, forcing himself to sound tired, vulnerable. He lay in bed, feigning sleep, while every fiber of his being was alert, waiting for the moment when Marie would make her move. Hours passed, the house silent except for the occasional creak as it settled. George's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his breathing slow and steady. Then, just after midnight, he heard it, the subtle creak of the bed as Marie slipped out, moving quietly towards the door. She paused, as if checking to make sure he was asleep, then continued down the hallway, her footsteps barely audible. George waited a few moments before rising silently from the bed. He moved to the door, listening intently. Downstairs, he could hear the faint murmur of voices, Marie and her lover, Peter, discussing the final steps of their plan. He heard the click of the front door as Peter entered, the two of them moving through the house like ghosts. George's heart raced as he listened to Marie and Peter. They were methodical, pouring gasoline around the house, their footsteps soft on the wooden floors. The smell of fuel began to seep into the air, acrid and sharp, mixing with the cold night breeze that slipped in through the cracks of the old windows. George knew he had to act fast. He moved quickly, locking the bedroom door from the inside and securing the wedge under the windows, ensuring that it couldn't be opened. Then, with a steady hand, he grabbed the escape rope he had prepared earlier, hidden in the back of the closet. He attached it to the heavy bed frame, knowing it would hold his weight. With one last look around the room, George climbed through the attic hatch, carefully lifting himself into the narrow space above the ceiling. He crawled through the dark, cramped passage, the old wooden beams creaking under his weight. His heart pounded in his chest, each thump reverberating in his ears. As he reached the attic vent, he paused, listening to the sounds below. Marie and Peter were just outside the bedroom, whispering urgently. "Are you ready?" Marie asked, her voice low but tense. Peter responded, his voice trembling. "Let's do this quickly. I don't want to be here when the fire spreads." George could almost hear the strike of the match, the faint whoosh as the flame caught the gasoline-soaked rags. He knew he had only moments before the fire would begin to consume the house. With a deep breath, George pushed open the attic vent and slipped out onto the roof. The cool night air hit his face, a stark contrast to the heat that would soon engulf his home. He moved quickly, making his way to the edge of the roof where the escape ladder was hidden behind a thick layer of ivy. As he descended the ladder, the first tendrils of smoke began to curl up from the windows below. The fire had taken hold, spreading with terrifying speed. George reached the ground and moved to a safe distance, turning to watch as the flames began to lick at the walls of his house. Inside, Marie and Peter were unaware of the trap that had been set for them. They had just finished lighting the fire when they turned to leave, only to find the door locked and the windows jammed shut. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. Marie rushed to the door, pounding on it with all her strength. "George! George! Open the door!" she screamed, her voice filled with terror. Peter ran to the window, trying to pry it open, but the wedge held firm. "It's stuck. We need to get out," he shouted, his voice breaking with fear. But there was no escape. The flames spread quickly, feeding on the gasoline-soaked walls, turning the house into a blazing inferno. The heat was unbearable, the smoke thick and suffocating. Marie and Peter's screams echoed through the night, but no one came to their rescue. George watched from the shadows, his face expressionless as the fire consumed everything. He felt a strange mix of emotions, grief for the life he had lost, anger at the betrayal, but also a grim satisfaction. Marie had tried to destroy him, to take his life and everything he had worked for. But in the end, it was her and her lover who paid the ultimate price. The fire raged on, reducing the house to ashes. By the time the fire department arrived, it was too late. The once grand home was nothing more than a smoldering ruin, the bodies inside charred beyond recognition. The authorities ruled it an unfortunate accident, the result of a faulty gas line that had sparked the blaze. George played the part of the grieving widower, mourning the loss of his wife and the life they had built together. He attended the funeral, accepted the condolences of friends and family, and watched as Marie and Peter were laid to rest in a joint ceremony, their true relationship hidden from the world. But beneath the facade, George felt a sense of closure. He had survived the betrayal, the attempt on his life, and emerged stronger for it. The house, the money, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was that he was alive, free from the lies and deceit that had poisoned his marriage. In the weeks that followed, George began to rebuild his life. He sold the remains of the house, donating most of the proceeds to charity, and moved to a small, secluded cabin in the mountains where he could find peace and solitude. The memories of Marie and the life they had shared haunted him, but he knew he had made the right choice. He had defended himself, taken control of his destiny, and ensured that those who sought to harm him paid the ultimate price. As he sat on the porch of his new home, looking out at the vast, untamed wilderness, George knew he would never trust so easily again. But he had learned a valuable lesson. Never underestimate the power of a man pushed to the edge. Weeks had passed since the fire, but for George, the memory of that night was still vivid. The flames seared into his mind. He had started a new life in the mountains, far away from the city and the painful reminders of Marie's betrayal. The secluded cabin offered the peace he craved, a place where he could try to heal and rebuild. But the tranquility he sought was elusive. Each night, as he lay in bed, the images of Marie and Peter's final moments haunted him. Their screams echoed in his dreams, pulling him back to that night over and over again. He told himself he had no choice, that it was them or him, but the rationalizations offered little comfort. Then, just as George was beginning to believe he could move on, a shadow from the past re-emerged. It started with a phone call. The ringing of the phone was jarring in the silence of his mountain cabin, and George hesitated before picking it up. Few people had his new number, and he wasn't expecting any calls. Hello? George's voice was cautious, guarded. The line crackled for a moment before a voice responded, smooth and unhurried. Mr. Clooney, my name is Detective William Harrington. I'm with the state police. I wanted to ask you a few follow-up questions regarding the fire that claimed your home and your wife. George's heart skipped a beat. He had prepared himself for the possibility of an investigation, but the fire had been ruled an accident. He thought he was in the clear. I thought the case was closed, Detective, George replied, keeping his tone neutral. There's no need for concern, Mr. Clooney, Harrington said, his voice calm. It's just standard procedure. A few things didn't quite add up in the initial report, and I'm just tying up loose ends. Of course, George said, though his mind was racing. What do you need to know? Just a few routine questions, Harrington replied. First, can you tell me again where you were when the fire started? George took a deep breath. I was asleep in the bedroom. I woke up to the smell of smoke and tried to get out, but the door was jammed. I managed to escape through the attic. Interesting, Harrington said, a hint of something unreadable in his tone. You're very lucky to have made it out. George forced a small laugh. Luck or instinct, I suppose. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and George could almost hear the detective weighing his next words. One last thing, Mr. Clooney. Were you aware of your wife's relationship with Peter Bennett? The question hit George like a punch to the gut. So, the affair wasn't as hidden as he had thought. He steadied himself, choosing his words carefully. I suspected something, but I didn't know for sure, he lied. I was focused on saving my own life that night. Of course, Harrington replied, his tone polite but with an undercurrent of doubt. Thank you for your time, Mr. Clooney. If I have any more questions, I'll be in touch. As George hung up the phone, he felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. The detective's questions were routine on the surface, but there was something in his tone, something that made George uneasy. Over the next few days, George couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he left the cabin, he felt eyes on him, as if someone was observing his every move. At first, he told himself it was just paranoia, a natural response to the stress of the investigation, but the feeling only grew stronger. One evening, while returning from a hike, George noticed a car parked just down the road from his cabin. It was an unmarked sedan, the kind often used by law enforcement or private investigators. The driver sat motionless, watching him. George's instinct screamed at him to confront the driver, to demand answers, but he forced himself to stay calm. He continued walking, acting as if he hadn't noticed the car. As he reached the cabin, he glanced back and saw the car pull away, disappearing down the road. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay awake, going over every detail of the fire, every precaution he had taken. Had he missed something? Was there evidence left behind that could implicate him? As dawn broke, George made a decision. If someone was watching him, if there was more to this investigation than he knew, he needed to find out. He couldn't just sit and wait for them to come to him. The next day, George drove into town, stopping at a small coffee shop. He ordered a coffee, then took a seat by the window, his eyes scanning the street outside. After a few minutes, the same unmarked sedan appeared, parking across the street. The driver remained inside, but George could see the silhouette of a man watching him. George pulled out his phone and pretended to make a call, all the while keeping an eye on the car. He had a plan, but it was risky. If this person was a private investigator or a detective, they would be prepared for confrontation. But if he could catch them off guard, maybe he could learn who was really behind this. Finishing his coffee, George stood up and walked out of the shop, heading down the street at a brisk pace. As he reached the corner, he ducked into an alleyway and waited. Moments later, the sedan pulled around the corner, slowly following his path. As the car neared the alley, George stepped out in front of it, forcing the driver to slam on the brakes. He walked up to the driver's side window and knocked, his expression cold and unyielding. The window rolled down, revealing a man in his late 40s, with sharp features and a calm, calculating gaze. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice smooth and controlled. George stared at him for a moment, then said, "I know you've been following me. Who are you, and what do you want?" The man didn't flinch. "Mr. Clooney, I'm just doing my job." "What job?" George demanded, his patience wearing thin. The man sighed, as if reluctant to reveal too much. "I'm a private investigator, hired by Marie's family. They have some concerns about the fire, and they've asked me to look into it." George felt a surge of anger. The fire was ruled an accident. What more do they want? The investigator's eyes didn't waver. "They want the truth, Mr. Clooney, and so do I." George knew he was in dangerous territory. The investigator, whose name he later learned was Robert Hale, wasn't going to back down easily. Hale was a seasoned professional, and it was clear that he had already uncovered more than George was comfortable with. Over the next few days, Hale's presence became a constant shadow in George's life. The investigator was meticulous, following up on every lead, questioning anyone who might know something about Marie, Peter, or George himself. Hale was digging into George's past, trying to find any weakness, any crack in his story. George's unease grew with each passing day. He had always been careful, but Hale was relentless, and George feared that the investigator would eventually uncover something that could unravel his carefully constructed alibi. One evening, as George sat in his cabin, going over the events of the past few weeks in his mind, he realized he couldn't just sit and wait for Hale to find something. He needed to take action, to protect himself before it was too late. The next day, George drove into the city, making his way to a nondescript office building on the outskirts of town. He had made a few discreet inquiries and found someone who could help him, a man named Victor, who specialized in solving problems for people with nowhere else to turn. Victor was a tall, imposing figure, with a reputation for being ruthless when the situation called for it. He listened as George explained his predicament, his expression unreadable. You want me to take care of this Hale guy? Victor asked, his voice cold and detached. George hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. I just need him to stop. He's getting too close. Victor nodded, as if he had heard similar requests 100 times before. I can make him disappear, but it won't be cheap. George knew what Victor was implying, and the thought made his stomach turn. He had already crossed one line. Was he really prepared to cross another? But as he thought about the alternative, Hale uncovering the truth, the police reopening the case, his life unraveling, he knew he had no choice. Do it, George said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. But make it look like an accident. Victor's lips curled into a small, humorless smile. That's what I'm best at. The following days passed in a blur. George went about his routine, trying to maintain a facade of normalcy, but inside, he was on edge, waiting for news that Hale had been dealt with. He knew Victor was efficient, but the waiting was torture. Then, one evening, as George was sitting on his porch, the phone rang. He picked it up, his heart pounding in his chest. It's done, Victor's voice said, without any preamble. Hale won't be bothering you anymore. George felt a wave of relief, but it was quickly followed by a crushing sense of guilt. He had crossed another line, and there was no going back. Thank you, George said quietly. Don't thank me, Victor replied. Just remember, if anyone comes asking questions, you don't know me, and you don't know anything about what happened to Hale. Understood, George said, and with that, the line went dead. That night, for the first time in weeks, George slept deeply. The shadow of Hale had been lifted, and he allowed himself to believe that he could finally move on, that his nightmare was over. But when he woke the next morning, there was a knock at his door. George's heart skipped a beat as he opened it to find Detective Harrington standing on his porch, his expression grim. Mr. Clooney, I'm afraid I have some bad news, Harrington said, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine regret. Robert Hale was found dead last night. It appears to have been an accident, but given the circumstances, I need to ask you a few more questions. George felt the ground shift beneath him. The trap was tightening, and he was running out of options. He had made one too many enemies, and now the consequences were closing in on him. George's mind raced as he tried to keep his composure in front of Detective Harrington. The death of Robert Hale, the private investigator, was supposed to be the end of George's troubles, not the beginning of new ones. But here was Harrington, standing on his porch, asking more questions. Of course, Detective, George said, masking his anxiety with a calm demeanor. What do you need to know? Harrington stepped inside, his eyes scanning the modest cabin. I understand that Hale was looking into your wife's death. Did he contact you recently? George nodded. Yes, he reached out. He said he was hired by Marie's family. They were still struggling with her death, and they wanted to know more about what happened. We spoke a couple of times, but that's all. And how did you feel about that? Harrington asked, his gaze piercing. George hesitated, choosing his words carefully. It wasn't easy. I've been trying to move on, and digging up the past was painful, but I understood where they were coming from. Harrington nodded thoughtfully, but there was something in his eyes that made George uneasy. Hale was a thorough investigator. He didn't leave many stones unturned. Did he find anything that concerned you? George forced a smile. Not that I'm aware of. He seemed focused on finding answers for Marie's family, but as far as I know, everything pointed to the fire being an accident. Harrington studied George for a moment before finally nodding. I appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Clooney. If anything else comes up, I'll be in touch. George showed Harrington to the door, his heart pounding. As soon as the detective left, George sank into a chair, trying to steady his nerves. He had dodged the questions for now, but he knew Harrington wasn't convinced. Over the next few days, George remained on high alert, expecting Harrington to return with more questions, or perhaps even a search warrant. He knew he couldn't stay in the cabin forever. The walls were closing in, and he needed a way out. Desperation led him back to Victor, the fixer who had dealt with Hale. George wasn't sure he could trust Victor, but he had no other options. He arranged a meeting in a secluded part of town, far from prying eyes. When Victor arrived, his demeanor was as cold and calculating as ever. "You're in deeper than I thought," he said, cutting to the chase. "Hale's death has put a spotlight on you. Harrington's not going to let this go." George clenched his fists, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. "I need a way out. Can you help me disappear?" Victor considered the request, his expression unreadable. "It won't be easy. Harrington will be watching your every move. But I have a plan that might work. It'll be risky, but if you're willing to take the chance, I can make it happen." George didn't hesitate. "Do it. I can't stay here any longer." Victor outlined the plan. George would stage his own death, making it look like he had been consumed by guilt and taken his own life. With no body, Harrington would have nothing to pursue, and George would be free to start over somewhere far away. The plan required careful execution. Over the next week, George followed Victor's instructions to the letter, preparing a fake suicide note and leaving behind just enough evidence to convince the authorities. On the night everything was set, George drove to a remote cliffside, where Victor had arranged for a car to be found at the bottom of the ravine. As George stood at the edge of the cliff, looking down at the darkness below, he felt a strange sense of relief. This was his escape, a way to leave behind the guilt, the fear, and the shadows of his past. He took one last look at the world he was leaving behind, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Weeks later, George emerged in a small coastal town under a new identity. He had cut ties with his old life completely, leaving no trace of the man he once was. The ocean air was crisp and clean, a sharp contrast to the smoke and fire that had haunted his dreams. George rented a modest house by the beach, where he spent his days fishing and enjoying the simple pleasures of life. He had always been a man who valued control, but now, for the first time in years, he felt a sense of freedom. The past was behind him, and the future was his to shape. In the months that followed, George slowly built a new life. He made friends with the locals, found solace in the quiet beauty of the ocean, and finally began to heal from the wounds of betrayal. The nightmares that had once plagued him faded, replaced by dreams of calm waters and endless horizons. As summer turned to autumn, George realized that he had found something he hadn't expected: peace. He no longer looked over his shoulder, no longer feared the consequences of his actions. He had paid a high price, but he had emerged on the other side with his life intact. One evening, as George sat on the porch of his new home, watching the sun set over the ocean, he felt a sense of closure. He had made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but he had also survived. And in that survival, he had found a chance at redemption, a chance to live the life he had always wanted. The past was behind him, and the future was wide open. For the first time in a long time, George allowed himself to smile. He was free.